In 1995, the Fourth World Conference on Women resulted in the groundbreaking Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action,
an agenda for change which set the tone for the next quarter century of feminist movement building across the globe.
In honor of this momentous gathering and the women and girls who made it possible,
Breakthrough is inviting activist leaders to reflect on what happened and where we go from here.
how have the lives of women and girls changed for the better or for worse?
And how do we keep up momentum in the fight for gender equality?
I'm Priyanka, Samy, and I'm a feminist based in Bangalore. And I think my experience over the last 9 years has focused on strengthening accountability ecosystems to shape governance and budgetary outcomes, budgetary processes and outcomes for the marginalized communities, particularly women. I'm a member of the National Federation of Dalit Women, and right now I'm sort of focusing on my work with women from historically marginalized communities, sort of building local capacities with a focus on addressing violence against them. I'm on the board of Frida, the Young Feminist Fund, and like Prabhleen, I'm also one of the UN Women's National Gender Youth Activists driving the generation equality agenda. So I'm very happy to be here, especially with such inspiring feminists. Thank you, Breakthrough, for the opportunity.
I'm Suneeta Dhar, and I live in New Delhi. I've been here for the last 37 years of my life. The previous ones have been in Bombay, a bit in Gujarat, and in Kashmir, where I was born. I have worked on several issues to advance gender equality and ending violence against women, as well as contributing to building safer spaces for women and girls and those from trans and other communities. And particularly in the last few years, and even now, I'm working with groups that are working on engendering livelihoods and building social support systems for women in the rural and tribal areas. My activism, which I'm very passionate about, I must say, is pretty muted these days because I have no feet on the ground for the last many months. It's just solidarity support or online, if one could consider online activism as such. I do feel rather disconnected and interconnected given the simultaneity of processes and changes that are happening around in my personal and in the lives of so many and the country and the world at large. So I'm happy to be part of this process. Thank you.
Zindabad friends, my name is Prabhleen. Natively speaking, I am actually from Chhattisgarh, but I've been in Delhi for almost a decade now. I came to the city to pursue my education and then got on to working with feminist organizations and the movement in Delhi. My work primarily has been around gender justice and rights, especially with adolescent and young people. I've been working with students' collectives and also been engaged in qualitative research across the issues of gender-based violence, sexual and reproductive health and rights, young women's livelihoods, and feminist leadership. Currently, I work at the YP Foundation. We are a youth-focused and youth-led collective. With a mission to develop young people's feminist leadership from a rights-based perspective, ensure their meaningful participation in creating programs and policies, and really legitimize youth leadership for social change. Glad to be a part of it.
Hi, I'm Roshmi Goswami. I'm based in Shillong. I am primarily from Assam, but I have lived in Shillong most of my life. I have worked on a range of issues, but my passion has always been women's human rights using CEDAW. And coming from the Northeast, focus has been very, very kind of strongly on women, peace and security, issues of conflict and conflict transformation. I have worn several hats. I have also been a funder for many years, been briefly with the UN, and in the last 8, 9 years, I've been part of the Urgent Action Fund, which is a fund for women human rights defenders, and have been instrumental for the Asia Pacific. Right now, I do very little actually. I am involved in a study, in an analysis of violent extremism, looking at state accountability. It's a multi country research project. And the other place that I am very active in is the South Asians for Human Rights, a human rights network of South Asia. Doesn't work only on women, it is larger issues, brings in all. I am the present co-chair of the organization and integrally involved in its functioning and in the advocacy.
Suneeta, I would like to pose a question to you. We all know that you were a part of the team that was involved in the Beijing Platform for Action process back in 1995. So, in your experience, what were some of the key issues during that time, and how did these discussions influence advocacy in India over the years? Over to you, Suneeta.
Thank you, Priyanka. It takes me back a long way, and I can only say that I can represent very little of the very rich and varied experiences that took place in the period 1993 to 1995, right up to the Beijing conference. If I were to go to the Beijing process, let me just focus on 2 or 3 significant pillars on which that process was built. Primarily because all of us in the unit and in our advisory committee, by and large, we were very new to UN and international processes. In fact, we were very new to some bits of national processes as well. And therefore, one of the bylines of the Beijing process, which stays in one's mind and which became a rallying point, and I remember, Ruth's contribution to taking it forward, was that looking at the world through women's eyes. And the question then we all asked were the eyes of which women? And therein lay the process of looking at representation geographically, sectorally, also looking at diverse gender identities, though a lot of depth, space. There was no safe space for many women to be, public about their own sexual and gender identities at that time. So that brought in representation, it brought in the voices of other women, it brought in diversity. It broke the barriers between the urban and the rural and the tribal and the remote. It's we who consider those that we cannot see on a regular basis as belonging to marginalized communities. But we know that inequalities, structural inequalities and inequalities in the system and policies and global systems has contributed to many communities living on the margins. So we had a very diverse representation across the Dalit community, the indigenous community, women from the mountainous region, women from conflict-affected areas, women in academia, women in the NGOs, women in the social movements, and so on. However, what was it that we could do collectively and in smaller collectives together, in the larger collective and smaller collective, was that not everybody could go to the Beijing conference. It's not possible. It was in Asia, and so the doors were open for the first time for specific amounts of funds to be available for the travel of women leaders from the grassroots communities. And so since everybody doesn't go to Beijing, how do you create a learning process, a process that's spiral in nature, that talks about sharing, accountability, representation, taking our voices? So a kind of a pedagogy was built by many of the leaders of the coordination process in ensuring that if you went for any conference, then you also came back relaying to everybody that you could and what you learned, what was that process about. So connecting the local to the global to the local, and demystifying the process of solidarity across the region. We had a very strong representation in South Asia, the grassroots women who went. On the other hand, we also had to demystify the tracks of advocacy. On the one hand was this huge NGO forum with close to 40,000 activists from around the globe got together, and due participation in that forum. On the other hand was the advocacy that had to be done vis-a-vis member states, your own country government, at the district level, at the state level, so that you could influence the Beijing platform for action. So these were some of the principles that we built into the process: representation, trying to bridge divides. We must remember this was not the time of social media. We didn't have telephones, we didn't have emails. We had something called a telex system. But female ways of communication, using the phones, each other, and the sheer commitment of so many women to be part of the process and to hold each other despite the huge difficulties that the process had within it. But at the same time, I must say there were some issues that never got representation. Women living with disabilities, the sex workers issues, issues of non-conforming, gender non-conforming persons, a deep intersectional justice approach we were learning. Because see, Beijing was about 12 critical areas. But women's lives are not segmented into 12 areas. They're segmented around their struggles, their movements for land, for resources, for decision-making, for governance, for a voice in the local governance system, etc. So some of these issues could have been dealt with, and I think subsequently have been dealt with. And also looking at women's representation and issues of climate change and climate justice. I think what resulted in the advocacy was new discourses, inclusion, new constructs on feminism, Dalit feminism, the indigenous women talking about their rights, breaking, ableism, constructs of ableism that were taken for granted, looking at race-based, caste-based, and other forms of discrimination, and, building solidarity across the generations. I think Beijing also taught us how to build solidarity. Many of us were young women then, and we continue to learn, and through the various instruments of advocacy and the various institutions that we belong to, these issues were taken forward down the line. Thank you.
Thank you, Suneeta. I think you've set the ground so strong for this conversation to go ahead. And Suneeta did talk about how the movement from international spaces went down to local realities, and then you've spoken about certain marginalization that one has faced. I think picking from both these aspects, Roshmi, I would like to ask you actually, what did it mean for the region that you represented, the entire Northeast region? And I am being conscious of the fact that there is no homogeneity there either. But what did it mean for you in the key role that was played in the Beijing process? And how did you understand intersectionalities back then in the team that got represented? If you would like to walk us through that journey.
Suneeta has very, very eloquently laid out what Beijing meant. How I think the whole Beijing process itself, we didn't use the word intersectionality in a very intentional way, but the process itself was intersectional. I mean, that was the core. I mean, when Ruth says women's voices, which women's voices was actually the lens through which the Beijing process kind of evolved. And so in that evolution, Ruth brought in issues of Dalit women and unorganized sector, not just Dalit, also unorganized sector. Somebody, Ilina and Sashi brought in issues from Chhattisgarh and so on and so forth. So each one, brought in. So we were, all of us kind of pushing this centric focus of Delhi and all of us bringing in our issues. For me, I was drawn into the Northeast process by my friend and colleague, Monisha Bell. to document and kind of raise issues which would be distinctive from the Northeast. And let me begin by saying that the Northeast, as you rightly said, Prabhleen, is not a homogeneous whole. And it is cannot be, it should not be ever. And that each community then, and I'm sad actually it has got diluted now because it has other political implications, were fiercely protective of their ethnic identities and their political commitment vis-a-vis that ethnic identity. And during that Beijing process, there was no ceasefire then. We were in the height of conflict in some of the areas, and brutal, violent conflict. It was a huge challenge to bring women with different political commitments, with different ideas, and a constant rejection of India in many of them. I remember Suneeta and all coming the coordination unit and getting used to this rhetoric of the Indians and us, the Indians and us, so there was all of that as well. So it wasn't that the Northeast women were felt so privileged that finally their issues were being represented or was being drawn. So it had to be very sensitively, the issues had to be drawn out because one had to acknowledge that there were movements against the Indian state. And we were at the same time trying to draw out issues of women within that struggle for self-determination where they were placed. So, you could not be perceived, and we were. I mean, every village meeting, I know that I was talking to women, there were people sent to watch what we were saying. Were we diluting the self-determination political movement? Were we kind of an Indian agent or not? So it was hell of a lot of balancing, but it was very, very exciting. It kind of taught me so much. Not just about the whole Indian women's movement, but the Northeast itself was so diverse. And then, of course, the huge dynamics of who gets represented in Beijing was in itself was a huge challenge, to say the least. But I must say, as Suneeta has pointed out, the Beijing process itself brought in so many different levels of power together. We were a constant consultation with the donor consortium. It wasn't like the donors were sitting there, there's a kind of invisible process and we were here. We were challenging, we were saying these issues, we need more money, we do this, we do that. So it was a great process. And one of the issues, of course, from the Northeast came out very strongly because there were huge sexual violence happening in the areas of conflict. So human rights came in a big way. So I think the Beijing process itself was interesting because it threw up so many other possibilities. Then there were numerous initiatives happening around Beijing. For me, the most important one was one, again, facilitated by the coordination unit, was a conference in Kuala Lumpur, which was called the Needs to Rights. And I think it had all the major human rights women or feminist women of the world there. And I just want to make one last comment on Northeast. The Northeast continues to be an area where, people say Northeast has to be represented and, all of that. But and you see many more voices and you see many more representation. But I think for me, it is very important that the representation is good in all of the categories in which they are represented, but a political vision and analysis is somehow far less now. I'm sorry. I mean, I'm talking about the younger generation. It's a larger connected to the ethnic struggles because the struggles took place because there were certain structural inequalities. Those have not gone away and they remain there. So what, Priyanka, you are absolutely right. The kind of representation has to go deeper into what are you representing. And UN processes must allow for voices that bring in a political questioning and a political resistance apart from, of course, each one's individual issue. And I think enough of that is not happening. And when I raise it, when women said, okay, we are influencing the women's manifesto, but I said, but it's the same thing we did 26 years back. What is the new thing here? Because now the political context is very different from what it was then. So it has to, again, the demands that we make has to also be aligned to what is the context within which we are making these demands. And somehow those aspects are kind of getting lost. Thank you.